12 I sat beside a shunned woman in church. By evening my chair was gone. There is a chair sitting in my living room right now. It is plain, straight-backed, made from ash wood with no cushion and no decoration. My daughter has asked me more than once why I keep it, since it does not match anything else in the room, and it is not particularly comfortable. I always tell her it reminds me of something important. She assumes I mean a person. She is not entirely wrong. I am Sarah. I am 61 years old, and I have not set foot inside a Gamay meeting house in 34 years. Not because I was forced out, because I walked out. But the walking came later, and it did not happen the way people who knew me then might imagine. It began with a chair, not this one, another one. One that was placed beneath me every Sunday morning for the first 27 years of my life, and then, one evening in October, was simply gone. I want to tell you what that meant. But to explain what the removal of a chair means inside the community where I was raised, I have to first explain what it meant to have one. In the district where I grew up in a quiet valley in eastern Ohio, the Sunday meeting did not take place in a dedicated building. It rotated through the homes and barns of the congregation, hosted by different families across the year. Benches were carried in on a long flat wagon the community called the bench wagon, unloaded by the men, and arranged in rows, men on one side, women on the other. The seating was not assigned in any written way. No one handed you a number or pointed you to a spot, but everyone understood where they sat. You sat in the same general position your family had always occupied. You sat near the same women you had sat near since childhood. The arrangement was never discussed because it never needed to be. It was simply known. For the women and girls of our congregation, your place in that room was not just a seat. It was a declaration. It told everyone watching, and everyone was always watching, that you belonged, that your family was in good standing, that you were connected in the congregation in the way a healthy branch connects to a tree. Sit where you always sat was to be confirmed, quietly and without ceremony, as a full member of something larger than yourself. I had sat in the same general area since I was old enough to sit without my mother holding me. To my left was usually my cousin Miriam. To my right, in later years, my closest friend Ruth, who had married the previous spring and whose new seriousness suited her in ways I had not expected. The bench we occupied was perhaps 4 rows from the front on the women's side, close enough to hear the minister clearly, far enough back not to feel exposed. I had sat there so many times that the wood of that particular bench had become familiar to me in a way I could not have described to someone who had not experienced it. I knew how it felt under my hands. I knew the small warped section near the right end where the grain rose slightly. I knew it the way you know a place you have always been. I did not think of it as a privilege. Privileges are things you are aware of. I thought of it as simply existing. Her name was Lydia Brenneman, and she had been placed under the Meidung, the shunning, 14 months before the Sunday I am describing. I did not know the full reason at the time. In our district, the particulars of a shunning were not announced to the congregation the way some matters were. You knew when someone had been placed under the ban because their behavior in the community changed overnight. They were not greeted the way others were greeted. Their family spoke of them with a particular careful silence, the kind that is louder than speech. You did not eat at the same table as a shunned person. You did not accept anything directly from their hand. You did not sit beside them. What I had gathered, from fragments of conversation I was not supposed to be part of, was that Lydia had refused a second instruction from the bishop after being counseled privately about something involving her husband's family. She had not left the community. She had not joined another church. She had simply refused to comply with one directive, and that refusal, under the ordnung of our district, was enough. She continued to attend Sunday services. That was unusual but not unheard of. A shunned person could attend. They sat apart. They participated in the worship itself, the singing, the silence, the sermons. But they were separated spatially from the rest of the congregation in a way that made the separation impossible to ignore. She sat at the far end of the women's section, near the wall, in a chair that was not one of the benches carried in from the wagon. It was a single wooden chair, straight-backed and plain, carried in each week from whatever room of the host home it had come from. Different each Sunday, always placed apart. I had looked at her from across the room for 14 months. I had looked at her the way you look at something you are trying not to look at. She was perhaps 40 years old. She kept her eyes forward during the sermons. She sang without hesitation. She did not appear ashamed. That, I think, was what I could not stop noticing. She did not perform repentance, she simply attended. She sat in her separate chair each week, as though the separation were a fact about geography, rather than a judgment about her soul. I had never spoken to her directly. I had no reason to, and considerable reason not to. The Sunday in October was cold in the way that October in our valley could be sudden and complete. We were meeting at the Yoder farm that week, in the large front room that the Yoders open twice a year for congregation use. I arrived with my mother and my younger sister, hung my coat on the row of wooden pegs inside the door, and moved toward the women's section. The room was not yet full, people were still settling. The bench wagon's contents had been arranged, but there was some variation this week. The Yoder front room was narrower than most, and the benches had been shifted slightly to accommodate the shape of the space. My usual area was reorganized. Miriam was slightly further forward than normal. Ruth had taken a spot near her new mother-in-law. There was a gap, a small and unremarkable gap, in the row where I would normally have sat. I did not think about what I was doing. I want to be honest about that, because I have spent many years examining that moment, turning it over the way you turn a stone to see what is beneath it. I did not make a principled decision. I did not sit down beside Lydia Brenneman as a statement of solidarity or as an act of defiance. I moved into the room. I saw the gap in my usual area was slightly awkward to reach without stepping past several women who were already seated, and I chose the path of least disruption. There was an open space near Lydia. I sat down. She did not look at me. I did not look at her. Singing began. For the first 20 minutes of the service, I was barely aware of what I had done. The worship settled over the room the way it always did, the slow familiar hymns from the Ausbund rising and falling, the minister beginning his sermon in the unhurried way of our tradition. I was present in the way I was always present on Sunday mornings, which is to say, partly attentive and partly occupied with the texture of my own thoughts. It was only during the second sermon that I became aware of eyes, not staring. It was never staring in our community. You did not stare. But I began to feel, in the peripheral way you feel something before you can name it, that the configuration of attention in the room had shifted. Several women 2 rows ahead of me had oriented themselves slightly differently. My mother, across the room on the far side of the men's section's boundary, had a stillness to her posture that I recognized. It was the stillness she used when she did not want her face to be read. The service ended. We rose. The room began to reorganize itself for the fellowship that followed. Lydia Brenneman walked to the door without speaking to anyone. I watched her go. Then I turned to find my mother. My mother looked at me for a long moment without speaking. Then she said very quietly, "Go help with the dishes." I went. The chair I had sat in that morning was not one of the wagon benches. Because of the Yoder room's narrow layout, several regular chairs from the Yoder household had been added to supplement the benches along the wall. The one I had occupied was a plain ash-wood chair, straight-backed, with a slightly uneven rear leg that had made it rock almost imperceptibly when I shifted my weight. I had noticed this during the service without paying it particular mind. By the time the fellowship meal was cleared and the congregation began to disperse, that chair had been moved. I did not see who moved it. I looked for it when I returned to the room after washing dishes, not because I intended to sit in it again, but because I had left my wool shawl draped over its back during the meal, and I needed to retrieve the shawl. The chair was gone. My shawl was folded on a bench near the door, placed there by someone who had taken the trouble to move it without being asked. The chair itself was back in whatever interior room of the Yoder house it had come from. I picked up my shawl. I did not ask about the chair. Something in me already understood that asking would be the wrong response. The way you understand certain things about a room before you have consciously analyzed the room. I folded the shawl over my arm and went to find my family. That evening my father called me into the kitchen after supper. My father was not a harsh man. I want to be clear about that because his role in what followed could be misread. He was a man shaped entirely by the community he had been born into, the way a tree is shaped by the particular slope of the hill it grows on. He did not invent what he believed. He had received it as his father had received it, and he had found genuine peace inside it. When he sat across the kitchen table from me that night and folded his hands and looked at me with an expression I can only describe as reluctant, I knew he was not performing authority. He was genuinely burdened. He told me that the deacon had spoken with him briefly after the service. He told me that my seating that morning had been noticed and that it had caused concern. He did not say concern to whom or concern about what exactly, because in our district certain things did not require explicit statement. He told me that the deacon had said gently that it would be wise for me to make my position clear on the following Sunday. What does that mean? I asked. Make my position clear. He looked at the table. It means sit where you belong, Sarah. I asked him where I belonged. He did not answer immediately. Then he said, You know the answer to that. I did. That night I lay in bed and thought about the chair. The physical chair. I mean the ashwood one with the uneven leg. I thought about how ordinary it was. I thought about how I had sat in it for 2 hours without once considering what it was or where it had come from or what it might mean. I thought about how quickly it had disappeared. Folded shawl, empty space, no discussion. Someone had made a decision about that chair and carried it out so efficiently that I had not even witnessed it happening. I thought about Lydia Brenneman's face during the service, the way she had sung without hesitation. I did not sleep well. Over the following 3 weeks I tried to understand the shape of what I had stepped into. I want to be precise about this. Because it was not a dramatic unraveling, no one raised their voice at me, no one issued a formal warning. What happened was quieter than that. The and quieter things, in my experience, are often more disorienting than loud ones, because they give you nothing solid to push against. Ruth was cooler toward me. Not cold. Ruth was not a cold person, but there was a careful distance in her manner when we spoke after church that had not been there before. She asked about my mother, asked about my sister's sewing project, and then found a reason to be elsewhere. Second Sunday after the Yoder farm, she sat further from me than she normally would have, not on the other side of the room, not obviously far, but far enough that the gap between us had a shape to it. My cousin Miriam said nothing to me directly, but on the third Sunday, she chose a seat beside another woman before I had settled, something she had not done in years. The seating arrangement that had existed without discussion for 2 decades was quietly reorganizing itself around me. No one announced this. No one explained it. I simply noticed, Sunday by Sunday, that the invisible lines were being redrawn and that I was being moved, not pushed, not shoved, but moved, the way water moves around a stone to the edges of the pattern. I went to my mother in the 4th week. She was kneading bread when I came in, and she did not stop. I sat at the kitchen table and told her what I had been observing, not emotionally, simply as a series of facts. I told her about Ruth, about Miriam, about the way the room felt different. She kept kneading. After a long moment she said, You made a choice, Sarah. Choices have consequences. I sat down, I said. I sat in an empty seat. There are no empty seats, she said. Not in the way you mean. I did not know how to answer that, because she was not wrong, exactly. She had articulated something that I had half understood since the morning at the Yoder farm, that in our community, a seat was never merely a seat. It was a position, and I had placed myself for 2 hours in a position the community had designated as separate. What should I do? I asked her. She turned the dough, pressed her palms into it, turned it again. Speak with the deacon, she said. Explain that it was a mistake. Ask what is needed. I looked at her hands working the dough. I looked at the familiar kitchen, the same shelves, same iron hook on the wall where the good apron hung. I thought about Lydia Brenneman sitting in her single chair near the wall, singing without hesitation. I thought about the deacon saying, through my father, to sit where I belong. I told my mother I would think about it. She said, Don't think too long. I did not speak with the deacon. I told myself for several weeks that I was simply gathering my thoughts, that I would act when I was ready, that there was no urgency, that the situation was not as serious as it felt on Sunday mornings when I could sense the room's recalibration happening around me. In December I asked my father, as carefully as I could, what Lydia Brenneman had actually done, what the original matter had been before the refusal that preceded the shunning. He was quiet for a long time. Then he told me that Lydia's husband had signed a document, years before their marriage, relating to a property arrangement with his family, and that when certain conditions of that arrangement had come due, Lydia had objected. She had not objected publicly. She had not filed anything with any outside authority. She had simply told the bishop directly that she believed the arrangement was unjust to her children, and that she would not encourage her husband to honor it. The bishop had counseled her privately. She had listened and had not changed her position. He had counseled her a second time. She had said the same thing again. That was it. That was the full account my father had. I sat with this for several days. I turned it over the way I had turned over the memory of the chair. A woman had disagreed with a financial arrangement that affected her children. She had said so clearly and refused to be persuaded otherwise. And for this, she sat alone near the wall every Sunday morning while the rest of us sang. I began to understand that my discomfort over the previous months was not about having made a social error. It was about something else. Something I did not yet have words for, something that lived beneath the surface of every Sunday morning, and every kitchen conversation, and every carefully arranged bench. In February, a woman I will call Esther, she was perhaps 10 years older than me, married to one of the ministers, found me alone after a service and spoke to me quietly near the coat pegs. She told me she understood that I was in a difficult position. She used those exact words. She said the congregation held me in regard, that my family was respected, and that nothing permanent had been decided. She said the deacon was patient, and that if I came to him with a humble spirit before the spring communion, the matter could very likely be resolved without further consequence. I asked her what further consequence would look like. She was quiet for a moment, then she said carefully, "You understand that a person who chooses ongoing association with someone under the ban takes on a measure of that separation themselves." I said I understood. She said, "I don't think you've been associating. I think you made a mistake in October, and you've been uncertain how to correct it. There is no shame in correcting a mistake, Sarah." She said my name the way people say a name when they want it to feel like a hand on a shoulder. I thanked her. I told her I would pray about it. She nodded and touched my arm briefly and walked away, and I stood at the coat pegs for a moment longer than I needed to before putting on my coat. The hope she offered was real. I felt it. I want to be honest about that too. For several weeks after that conversation, I felt something ease in my chest that I had not realized was tight. I told myself that I had been approaching this wrongly, that Esther was a sensible woman, and her counsel was sound, that going to the deacon with a humble spirit was not surrender, it was wisdom. I began to compose in my mind what I might say. I went to visit Lydia Brenneman in March. I did not plan this, or rather I had been not planning it for months, which is a different thing. I knew where she lived. Her property was on the far side of the valley, a gray farmhouse set back from a gravel road, with a kitchen garden that would not be green for another month. I had driven past it several times over the years without stopping. I stopped. She came to the door and looked at me without surprise. She invited me in. She made tea without asking whether I wanted any. We sat at her kitchen table, which was plain and worn and clean, and I looked at her hands around her cup, and I did not know how to begin. She began for me. She said, "You sat beside me in October." I said I had. She said, "It cost you something." I said I wasn't sure yet what it had cost. She looked out the window at the gray garden. Then she said something I have carried with me for 34 years. She said, "The chair they give you and the chair they take away are the same chair, Sarah. You just understand it differently the second time." I did not know, in that moment, what she meant exactly. I thought I did, but I have come to understand it more fully across the years since. What she meant, I think, is this: the chair that was placed beneath me each Sunday morning was not given in love, it was given in expectation. It was given as long as I occupied it in the correct way, which is to say, as long as I confirmed, by my posture and my placement and my avoidance of certain other chairs, that I accepted the entire arrangement of the room. When I stopped confirming that, the chair was no longer mine. It had never been mine. I had simply been permitted to use it. I drove home in the cold and sat in my own kitchen and did not compose anything more for the deacon. The spring communion came in April. I attended. I sat in the section I had always occupied, in the approximate area I had always used. I did not seek out the deacon before the service. I did not approach him after. I sang when we sang. I was present when we were present. I did not perform contrition because I had concluded, some time in the weeks since my visit to Lydia's kitchen, that I had nothing to be contrite about. I knew this would not be interpreted neutrally. On the Monday after communion, my father came to me again. This time his expression was not reluctant. It was something I had not seen on his face before, something that looked, from the outside, like a very controlled form of grief. He told me that the deacon had noted my continued failure to address the matter. He told me that the congregation's patience was not unlimited. He told me that without a clear expression of regret and a commitment to appropriate conduct, my status at the communion table, and by extension, my full standing in the community, was being formally reviewed. I said I sat beside a woman at a service. I visited her in her home. I don't believe either of those things requires regret. He looked at me, he said, "You know what you're saying." I said I did. He stood there for a moment longer. Then he nodded once, the way a person nods when a door they hoped might stay open has been heard to close. And he left the room. By June I was effectively shunned, though the formal process followed its own careful timing. The community did not rush these things. There were conversations, a members' meeting, a final opportunity extended to me, which I did not take. My mother cried. My sister did not speak to me for 8 months. Ruth, who had been my closest friend for most of my life, wrote me a letter that was precise and religious and kind in its way, and which made clear that she could not maintain our friendship within the constraints now imposed on her by my standing. I want to be accurate about the pain of this. It was not clean. It was not the kind of pain that announces itself with a clear shape. It was the pain of ordinary things disappearing, the sound of particular voices, smell of a specific kitchen, the way a room fills with women you have known since childhood, and the way that filling feels like belonging. I had not understood how much of my sense of self was constructed from those ordinary things until they were no longer available. But I had Lydia's kitchen, and I had what she had said, and I had eventually the wider world, which was frightening and overwhelming, and which did not have the particular quality of belonging I had grown up inside, but which had other things. Other chairs, so to speak. I left the valley that autumn. I am not going to narrate the years that followed in any detail, because they are a different story, and this story is about a chair. What I will tell you is this: some years after I left, I came across a second-hand furniture sale in the town where I had settled. Among the items was a plain ash wood chair, straight-backed, no cushion and no decoration. It had an uneven rear leg. When I sat in it, it rocked almost imperceptibly under my weight. I do not know if it was this chair. I am not a person who believes the world arranges itself into neat symbols for individual instruction. Probably it was not the same chair. There are many plain chairs in the world. I bought it anyway. I carried it home and set it in my living room, where it has been ever since. My daughter asks why I keep it. I tell her it reminds me of something important. What it reminds me of is Lydia's voice, saying that the chair they give you and the chair they take away are the same chair. And that you understand it differently the second time. What I understand now, at 61, is that she was right in a way that extended beyond church seating. The belonging I was given as a child, the place in the room, the position in the arrangement, the warmth of being confirmed each Sunday as a full member of something, was conditional in ways that were never stated to me because they did not need to be stated. The condition was invisible until I violated it. I violated it by sitting down. I do not know what became of Lydia. I lost contact after I left the valley. And the community I came from does not communicate easily with those who have left it. I hope she found something that resembled peace. She seemed, in the months I knew her, to have already found something in that direction. Something quieter and more self-contained than what most of us are taught to look for. The chair in my living room is uncomfortable. My daughter is right about that. But I have sat in it most mornings for many years now, with my tea and my thoughts, and it has never once been taken away. That, in the end, is the difference.